Hello and welcome to week 3 of our language development course. This week we're going to be focusing on theories on literacy development. So let's look at our agenda. I'm going to go over a grading strategy that occurred to me for the admin slips and the focus group observations. I think you're going to like that, hopefully, that strategy. We're going to get into activity 1, which I'm asking you to remember what it was like for you in learning and to read and write. Then we're going to briefly go over the theories of literacy development, which are part of your readings for this week. In activity 2, we're going to analyze that memory. And then we're going to go into that transactional perspective of that leads us to a comprehensive literacy instructional approach for literacy. And we're going to look at activity 3, in which we're going to look at an environment and see what changes we would make in light of this transactional perspective, and then focus a little bit on what teachers can do and highlight the homework for this week. So before we move into activity 1, the grading strategy that occurred to me for the admin slips and the focal group observations, or the focal child observation, is that I'm going to look at the first admin slip and the first observation that you turn in, and I'm going to give you feedback. But everybody's going to have the highest mark on the first one. And then based on the feedback, I'm going to be looking for in admin slips 2 and the next ones, and in the observation 2 and the following observations, I'm going to be looking at you meeting those comments and the feedback that I gave you for the first one. So you're going to start off with your full set of points, regardless of being having errors or having aspects that you need to work on. But then it's like you commit to working on that feedback for your next one. So if you still have those same mistakes or there's same missing components in admin slip 2 and observation 2, then you're going to get points deducted. But the first one should give you insights as to how to improve your observations and your admin slips so that you actually get your full points from there forward. So I think that's great because it gives you sort of the benefit of the doubt in the first one, and any mistakes that you make in the first one, you're not penalized for. You get your full credit for that first submission, and then you will be penalized if you don't make up for the feedback that you received in the future. But if you do, you continue to get full credit from there forward. So it's an opportunity for you to get full points in all admin slips and all observations if you take into account the feedback that you received. Okay, so let's move to activity 1. I want you to think about how you learned to read and write. So what types of activities do you remember doing in class? How did your first grade classroom look like? What kinds of books do you remember reading or listening to at school and at home? What did you struggle with? What did you enjoy the most? And think about this. There is a PDF sheet on Blackboard. I will upload the Word document version of it as well so that you can download it, type into it, and think about these ideas as we move forward in this presentation. So if you want, pause this right now, think about these questions, answer them quickly so that you have this sort of fresh in your mind as we move forward. Okay, so now let's focus on the theories of literacy development. So we're going to talk about 4 major theoretical perspectives. And you have in the first column of this table, you have the time period in which these theoretical perspectives were set forward and were sort of in vogue, that people were using them, teachers and educators were using them in the classroom. And then the second column tells you the name of the theoretical perspective. The third column explains what the theoretical perspective looks like in action. So how did children actually learn to read and write under this theoretical perspective. And then the last column is, how do we call this kind of perspective in the educational field? So as an instructional approach, what does this theoretical perspective, what is it called? Okay, so beginning with the behaviorist theoretical perspective that happened in the 50s, 70s, and that's when it was sort of more prevalent, and we would see it more in classrooms. Under this perspective, children must first learn a certain set of skills in order to advance to the next set of skills. So there's a specific sequence in which we need to learn aspects of reading and writing in order to actually learn to read and write and be able to do it, right? So for example, you won't be able to write a full sentence unless you are able to identify the words of the alphabet first, right? So there's certain things that you need to know first in order to get to the final being able to read and being able to write stage, right? So in instructional approach jargon, we call this reading subskills or readiness, literacy readiness. So there is the approach is called this, right? So there is an expectation that children need to meet certain skills and need to be ready to then learn to read and write. The naturalist theoretical perspective that happened in the 80s and 90s has a different view, sort of like a polar different view than the behaviorist one. So sort of the pendulum swings to the other side now. And then here, children learn to read and write through everyday experiences, everyday interactions. Everything can be a literacy event or be considered a literacy event. And so the instructional approach is whole language. And here we don't necessarily start by teaching children the alphabet and then teaching them sight words and then teaching them types of words and what the order is to make a sentence as we would teach them in the behaviorist approach. Here in the whole language approach, we might just look at a sentence, at environmental print of all of the literacy that is surrounding and around us in the environment and that the child interacts with, and we would just read whole paragraphs in order to help children with comprehension instead of focusing on letters and then moving up from there, right? The interactive theoretical approach happened in the mid-90s to the early 2000s. And this one involved a balance between the behaviorist and the naturalist. So children would learn to read and write through a combination of acquiring certain skills in a certain order, like the behaviorists say we should, and then a holistic everyday kind of experience with literacy like the naturalists say it should happen, right? So it's called a balanced approach where we're taking some of the behaviorist or the readiness, readiness, subskills focus and some of the whole language focus, and then we balance that into an instructional approach that we based on the interactive theoretical perspective. The transactional theoretical perspective happened in the early 90s, in the early 2000s, mid 2000s to the current day. So this is the approach that we're using currently. Here, children learn to read and write through transactions that involved the knowledge of language that they bring, so their prior knowledge regarding language. And we talked about this a little bit last week, of what those funds of knowledge look like. And then the text that they encounter, and typically in classrooms, the texts are provided by teachers, and then the social cultural context in which they're embedded. And in terms of an instructional approach, the transactional theoretical perspective in the instructional approach is called comprehensive literacy instruction. And that's the one that we will be focusing on the most. Here you can see this is the behaviorist perspective and how it works from the bottom up. So it starts from a very small unit, visually discriminating letters in order to then visually discriminate words, and being aware of what that grapheme looks like, and then going to phrases and sentences where letters are combined to make words and words are combined to make sentences, and how those then are structured, and then accompanied by the phonemes as well, because in reading you'll have the pronunciation or the decoding of these words and sentences. And then you go to the construction of meaning from the written word or the text, following word identification or decoding of the paragraph or the sentence that you're reading, to then get to reading comprehension. So you go from something really small to the goal, which is comprehending what you're reading in the behaviorist perspective. So you go bottom up. The model of reading is sort of from the bottom to the top. The naturalistic perspective goes reverse, goes to the top part down to the bottom. So it's a top-down kind of model for reading, where you start with a non-visual information. You have the prior knowledge of language that the learner or the child brings. You have the conceptual knowledge that they have of the world, and then the prior experiences that they might bring into sort of that literacy learning environment. So you start with this big funds of knowledge bag that they bring, right, with all these different characteristics of funds of knowledge. And then the brain is going to guide and direct visual discrimination of words and recognition process. But it's going to happen naturally for the child being exposed to this environmental print. And then from there, they're going to start constructing meaning until they get to this reading comprehension. So the reading comprehension is going to be the ultimate goal for all of these approaches. The way we get there is going to be different depending on how we're teaching children to read and to write. So the next model was the interactive perspective, is the balanced approach, where we have those funds of knowledge that come from the non-visual information, and we have the visual information, which is the perception or the direct instruction of the letters and the words that comes from the behaviorist theoretical perspective. And then you merge those two to find the construction of meaning. And then with the construction of meaning, you get to reading comprehension. So it's a balanced approach because it's pulling from both prior approaches that we spoke about. The last one is that transactional perspective, that is this comprehensive literacy instruction approach that we're focusing on. And here you have the reader or writer's knowledge of language. You have their receptive and expressive language skills that they bring. They bring also a linguistic knowledge, the 5 aspects, the 5 technical aspects of language that we've talked about in the prior 2 weeks. And they have the metalinguistic knowledge that we also talked about last week when we talked about the funds of knowledge. So all of these funds of knowledge that the learner, reader, writer brings is going to then merge with the context of reading and writing that they're immersed in. So the social, political, cultural context in which they are in terms of the community that they live in, the state that they live in, the country that they live in, and then this particular school and classroom in which they're enrolled. All of this is going to interact or have some transactional experiences with the text. And the text can be any text, but for our purposes, maybe we're thinking about a particular book that we're reading in the class. All of these 3 components have equal weight, and they're going to interact together for the construction of meaning that is going to give us comprehension in terms of reading, or it's going to give us expression in terms of writing. Okay, so now I want you to think about that first grade classroom that you thought about in your activity 1 when you were remembering. Think about that classroom that you remembered. And now, knowing these theories, which theories do you think informed your teacher's approach to literacy back then when you were in first grade? Which theory do you think that the teacher was pulling from, and which instructional approach was she enacting to help you improve or develop your literacy skills? So which approach do you think that she or he implemented in the classroom? And how do you know? So what kind of evidence do you know for this? So think about this. And again, you can pause this right now, go back to your activity sheet and answer those questions. Okay, so we are going to sort of tease out the transactional perspective that leads us to this comprehensive literacy instruction approach to reading and writing. So we said that the reader or the writer, the child, the learner, brings a gamut of knowledge that we call funds of knowledge, and they have the receptive and expressive language, the linguistic knowledge, the 5 aspects that we talked about, phonological, morphemic knowledge, and all the 5 components, and also has the metalinguistic knowledge, right? So we have that. We have the text that we have chosen, and the texts have certain characteristics to them. And then we have the context in which the reading and writing takes place, where we take into account all the social, cultural, political, linguistic setting in which the child is embedded, right? And the ultimate goal is the construction of meaning. But before we get to that construction of meaning, we have this component, the teacher, which is going to be really important. And the teacher serves a mediator role for the instruction. The teacher is going to make decisions about which kinds of texts are going to be introduced in the classroom, which kinds of materials, which kinds of approaches, which kinds of strategies are going to be offered for the child. The teachers have or has a knowledge base in terms of literacy development. And the teacher is going to supply the reader with the knowledge base in terms of gaps that the reader, writer, / learner might have. The teacher also has resources or access to resources like curriculum, materials, texts that they can choose from. And the teacher can also help the child interacting with them in their zone of proximal development. So helping the child perform at a higher level with the help of the teacher as a mediator than the child would perform on his or her own. And then the teacher has observations of her actual students, the students that she has in her classroom, and what they specifically need. So with all this information and all these resources, and all of this a circle of influence that the teacher has, then the teacher will mediate the student's knowledge of language, the texts that are being used to facilitate reading and writing, and the context in which they're all embedded to lead to the construction of meaning, in which, again, comprehension is going to be acquired through reading and expression is going to be acquired through writing. So we see that in this kind of approach, the teacher is going to be key and is going to mediate this entire experience, learning experience in terms of literacy for the learners. So activity 3, and this is the one that you're going to post onto the discussion board, right? So you've done activity 1 when you remembered your classroom. You've done activity 2 where you've analyzed what kind of theory and approach your teacher was doing based on what you remember from your experience. And then in activity 3, you're going to look at the environment and the materials and the arrangement of the classroom, the curriculum, the strategies, either in your current placement, and if you're not in a classroom right now, think about your prior internship placement or internship setting where you were last semester. So you're going to answer this question: what story does your classroom tell? Just by looking at it, right? And how can you rewrite this story to meet the transactional perspective to literacy instruction? And you're going to look specifically at the classroom environment, at the library, at the room arrangement, at the curriculum, and at the teaching strategies. So within these 5 elements, what is the classroom telling you, and what would you change to rewrite that story that the classroom is telling in order to meet that transactional perspective or literacy instruction? And we're going to go through some questions. In terms of the classroom environment of the curriculum, ask yourself, do the classroom resources balance racial, linguistic, cultural, and gender images with those of whiteness, which are the most common ones, right? Does the classroom foster racial literacy? And racial literacy is the ability of children to read their own worlds, their own race, in the books and the text that they encounter. So does the classroom foster this? Are there posters on the walls that reflect this? Is there text that reflects the linguistic diversity in the classroom? And this is important here that there are studies that have found that children as young as 6 months show negativity towards Blackness. So a child as young as 6 months already has been indoctrinated to see Blackness as negative. So think about that, and think about the responsibility that you have as a teacher to present children with this racial literacy that actually portrays diversity and racial and ethnic diversity in a positive light, so that you can combat or push back towards this already years of indoctrination against Blackness. So C, does the curriculum reflect people who are white or mostly white? Is that all that you see there? Does the curriculum portray minority groups as problems or victims? So even if the minority groups are being represented, are they the villains? Are they the bad guys? Then are popular individuals positioned to represent their entire race as a cultural group? Like, for example, talking about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and just making these rash generalizations that all Black people are like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and that's all we need to know about them. Is that what's happening in your classroom? Does the curriculum reflect an all or mostly all male population? Does the curriculum reflect English language learners and those that have a diverse linguistic background? In looking at your classroom library, look at the books and ask yourself, do the books reflect multiple diversities in language, races, culture, identities, disabilities? Are they represented in these images and in the text in these books? Do the books mainly portray animals? Or are there people here? And who and which people are they being portrayed? Do the books portray stereotypical images of racial or cultural groups? So are the minorities always represented doing what a certain strata of that minority group does? Or are they portrayed in different kinds of roles where a person of any background could do? Do the books offer windows? So offering views into worlds that might be different from the children, so that they can see different ethnical groups, different languages from their own. Do the books offer mirrors where the children can see themselves, when they can see themselves and their lives represented in these books? And do the books offer bridges where we can see these social isms like racism, ableism, and so on being challenged? So not just saying, oh, this is happening, but how can we fix this? What can we do to make it better? And then lastly, in the room arrangement, ask yourself, does the setup of the classroom allow students opportunities to work in mixed gender, mixed race, mixed language groups during academic and social events and activities? Is there room for movement in the room? Are classroom resources posted at eye level so that children can engage with them? Does the room setup allow for groups to be flexible? Is there a meeting area where we all come together as a community? Are there different types of seating available for the different needs of the children? Is there an accessible classroom library available and open to the children to use? Is there a space for play and free play for the children? So these are questions that you're going to ask yourself. Again, if you're not in a setting right now, think about the setting that you were in last semester and apply these questions to that setting. Okay, so what can teachers do? One of the things that teachers can do is they can center families in the curriculum, so they can include families in the curriculum, have families come in and share their authentic experiences with the class. They can focus on authenticity in the curriculum and the classroom library and be very careful and intentional with the materials and the books that are being brought into the classroom. And they can also build in time for play. So with social interactions, children are going to get to meet and have a first-hand experience with children that are from different backgrounds from their own and learn that way, and not necessarily through the eyes of someone who wrote a book or through the experiences of the teacher, but have actual first-hand experiences themselves. And then more, which is going to leave it open to all the things that you contribute to as how would you change these 5 aspects that we're looking at: the classroom environment, the library, the arrangement, the curriculum, and the teaching strategies. How would you change them so that they would be more aligned with that transactional perspective that gives us a richer learning experience in terms of literacy development? Okie doke, so we are to our last slide for this week, and this is just a reminder of what the homework is. So this week you have admin slip number 1 is due on Monday. Then the readings that you're going to base this admin slip off of are Soto, Manning, and Martel chapter 3 and Otto chapter 2. We touched upon some of these things in this presentation, but there's much more in those chapters that you can read about. And then the discussion board that is mainly activity 3, in which you're going to, again, look at what the story, what the classroom's story is, what is that classroom telling when you look at it, and then how would you change that story to make it more aligned with a transactional perspective. That is it. I will see you again or talk to you again next week. Bye.